This is the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria, session number 29.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Hey everybody, welcome to today's session of the Behavioral Observations Podcast. You know, in the last two sessions, you've heard me talk about a new sponsor for the show, Britton Behavioral Consulting, more specifically the services of one Dr. Lisa Britton. And she specializes in providing high-quality independent fieldwork supervision. And so I thought it would be a good idea to have her on the show because this is such a hot topic in our practice today. So think of today's episode as a deep dive into all things supervision. And this is not only from the standpoint of the supervisor, but also she gives some great advice in terms of people looking for supervision and things like that. And again, I just want to be abundantly transparent that this is a sponsor of the show, and I'm excited to feature Lisa as a sponsor because she does such a great job in her supervision work. So again, this is a deep dive into supervision. One of the things that I really appreciate is that so many of you took time to write in with specific questions. So thank you to all those who submitted questions for this interview. They really help make this podcasting process very interactive in nature, which is great fun for me. And I hope you guys enjoy that aspect as well. If you do want to get in on this question asking process, go ahead and go to behavioralobservations.com and sign up for the mailing list. I usually send out an email prior to conducting an interview. And I usually announce the guest and ask people on the email list for specific questions or topics or whatever they want to get into. So if you're not on the email list, again, head on over to Behavioral Observations. There's a big red button on the upper right-hand side of the page, and hit that button, follow the prompts from there, and you'll be good to go. In today's episode, we talk about aspects of just general supervision. And we also talk about doing remote supervision. We get into specific tactics and tools and good stuff like that. So if you are listening to this while you're driving, don't worry. I've got all the information in the show notes, again, at behavioralobservations.com, session 29. And we will also have this episode available for a supervisory continuing education credit, a Type 2 BACB credit, the one we all want, right? So I will have that available either as this episode's published or shortly thereafter. So you can get all that information at behavioralobservations.com/getCEs. But I don't want to belabor the point too much more, and so without any further delay, please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Lisa Britton. Dr. Lisa Britton, welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Matt. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Thank you so much for joining me today, and we're going to talk about all things supervision, and I really appreciate you joining me because this is such an important and crucial aspect of our practice. I was fortunate enough to participate in a supervision panel at the recent ABAI in Denver, and I thought it was going to be like the panel I did the year before, where there was going to be maybe like a dozen or two dozen people showing up, and this was a packed crowd of like 200 people, and I was just blown away. And I don't think they were there to see me. I think they were there to certainly get their supervision CE, but obviously it's a very important topic, as I said, and I'm really glad that you're able to join us to shed some light on some great supervision practices, both in the general sense and as in the context of doing things remotely. But before we get into that, I want to ask you about how you first learned about behavior analysis, and when did you figure out this is what you wanted to do as a grown-up?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Matt. I'm a product of my environment, just like everybody else is. I grew up in North Dakota, and I went to the University of North Dakota for my undergraduate training. I always knew that I wanted to get a PhD in psychology, but I think I was one of those typical people who thought, I'll be a child clinical psychologist, save the world one child at a time kind of thing. And I think that program was rather eclectic. And there was one person that was a behavior analyst who was doing some really great work, and his name was Dr. Joe Plod. And he taught, it was a BMOD class and a learning class, and I really started to enjoy the things that he was doing and became interested in behavior analysis that way. So it was time to apply to graduate programs, and I applied to some behavioral programs in addition to the clinical programs that I was interested in. I did an interview at the University of Nevada in Reno, and I really just fell in love with that program. I thought it was a great fit for me, and I was really excited when I got an offer, and I was able to go there to do my graduate training. What
made Reno stand out to you? The only reason I asked this, it just occurred to me that you're probably like the fourth or fifth person from UNR that I've had on the podcast.
Yeah, I've actually noticed that you have quite a few UNR folks that you interview. The program was just really. I thought that the team of faculty there really had a great understanding of behavior analysis. I loved how they had a three-pronged approach in terms of focusing on behaviorism and the philosophy, looking at EAB and having a good foundation in terms of the experimental analysis, and then, of course, having the applied approach, which was what I was specifically looking for. But really having that breadth of experience, I think, is very important.
Who did you study with there?
I worked with Jim Carr, which is actually another interesting story. On our first day of introductions, all the new grad students were sitting around the table, and there was another person that was there who I assumed was one of the grad students. He was a young man who was in a leather jacket, looking pretty spiffy. And as we were going around and doing introductions, lo and behold, this was our newest faculty member. And to my surprise, as we were getting our assignments on who was going to be working with whom, I was scheduled to actually be one of his grad students. I was really shocked, and I have to say, initially disappointed, because I thought, oh great, I've got the new guy. What is he going to teach me? So it was pretty ironic, given the fact that obviously he was fantastic, and it was a great experience.
Oh, wow. What a funny story. So that must have been his first real gig after getting his doctorate.
It absolutely was. So, I think it was just like a few weeks before he turned 27. So definitely new to the world of being a faculty member, for sure.
Now, I have heard of this phenomenon called assistant professor syndrome, where new faculty, when they first get their hands on graduate students, really, this is not really a polite way to say this, but essentially put the screws to the to the grad students, because they finally have had the opportunity to transfer all the knowledge that they've spent all these years, acquiring and things like that. So, can you talk about the experience of that a little bit more, about kind of how that all shook out in terms of working with the newest faculty member and things like that?
Well, luckily for me, Jim had a great approach. He very much had the perspective of using reinforcement in shaping procedures, luckily. So it was actually a great experience. One thing that I can say about Jim is that he was very good at ensuring that projects were broken down into doable steps. And so there was that constant action. I was able to very much stay on track, in part by his ability to be able to make things doable throughout the process. And he would always say, after every milestone, he would say, watch that post-reinforcement pause. And so we would get going on the next activity. So I would defend my thesis. All right, now let's get going on that comp. then get that comp through. Let's focus on the next one, and so forth. So it was a really nice experience in terms of keeping that focus going.
Awesome. Did you get steeped in relational frame theory and ACT and all that stuff being out in Reno?
Not too much. Interestingly enough, I probably am doing a little bit more in terms of researching that information now as a supervisor than I did while I was a graduate student. So of course you can't be at Reno without getting some exposure to that, and that was really great information for us to have, for all of us to have. But I would say that I'm diving into that a little bit more now as, I have supervisees who are interested in learning about peak. Certainly, I have some supervisees who are working with adolescents with emotional and behavioral issues who really, the foundations under the ACT model can really help them understand those students and those clients a little bit better.
Nice. Yeah. Well, I mean, I would also imagine that at the time, probably both relational frame theory and acceptance commitment therapy, those probably weren't as well developed and or as popular as they are these days. Where I just obviously came back from ABA, and there were many presentations on peak and as well as some of the RFT underpinnings of it and things like that. So. Pretty cool. So you made a nice segue there for me. You saved me a little bit of work talking about supervision. So in terms of giving those examples of your supervisees. So let's go with that then. So what made you want to focus on providing supervision in your practice? I know that's kind of a big component of what you do these days.
Absolutely. So I was doing quite a bit of supervision during the work that I was doing at Spectrum Center Schools and Programs. They have several schools throughout California and across some other states as well. And as I was doing that supervision, I was really finding that I was enjoying that process in terms of building somebody's skill sets, taking the information that they've learned through their coursework and looking at how to apply that with their clinical issues. Along the same lines, I was feeling a bit of frustration in terms of seeing some supervision situations not going quite as well as I would like to see. And so the combination of those two things, along with one of my colleagues, she ended up switching positions and going to a district, and she wanted me to continue supervising her as she made that transition. And at first I was like, oh no, I can't really do that. But then as I started thinking about it, I was like, well, why can't I? Mm-hmm. Well, what's stopping me from doing that? And I started to think about what would need to be in place to really provide that supervision in a different way. And so I spent a few months developing a scope and sequence based off of the 4th edition task list to really identify what are the core competencies that people need in order to be a successful behavior analyst as they get to the point of being able to sit for that exam.
Very cool. So I want to get back to that in a second, and I'll look at those core competencies. And so what I want to do is ask some general questions about supervision, the supervision process, and then talk about remote supervision. And, I'm kind of dipping my toe back into that water. I supervised a bunch of candidates for BCABA and BCBA candidates over the years, but I've kind of gotten out of it just because of time constraints and things like that. I'm slowly getting back into it, and it's been post the 2014 rule changes and things like that. So it's a little bit of a different ball game, back when I think when people of our generation were being supervised, it was a much different process. I think you had to work for some place for like 3 years, and the clinical director came in and signed a paper and patted you on the back, and you sent your transcripts in, and you took the exam with paper and pencil. And obviously these days it's a much different ball game. So I want to backtrack a little bit because it sounded like you started talking about some negative supervision experiences that you've heard about. And I think we've all heard kind of horror stories of supervision going, kind of the wrong way. And that sometimes can occur from both the supervisor or the supervisee's perspective. So given your experience in supervision, what would you say are kind of the big picture challenges to providing high quality supervision these days to candidates?
I would say that obviously nobody goes into the supervision experience planning on doing a poor job, and that just in some cases happens. And I think it comes down to competing contingencies. So I really like what you had to say in terms of, there were times when you chose not to be a supervisor simply because you didn't have the time. And I think that people underestimate the amount of time that it takes to be a good supervisor and a good supervisee. So I think that, the reality is that people have a full-time job with many other responsibilities, and sometimes they don't adequately prepare for those supervision meetings, and they aren't there to provide the necessary assistance both during those meetings and during those in-between times when people need some additional support. From the perspective of the supervisee, I think it's the same thing. They have, oftentimes a full-time job. They're trying to take 1 or 2 courses per semester, and then they're trying to do supervision on top of that. And so oftentimes I think supervision is the contingency that maybe has the weakest both reinforcer and potential punisher to go with not doing the work. And so you can see very quickly how that particular piece can just get missed at times, and people kind of start going through the motions instead of doing the quality work that needs to be done.
So based on that, how do you organize your supervision practices to kind of overcome some of these challenges?
A big piece of it is having a plan on the front end. So having that scope and sequence, knowing where I'm going to be taking people before we get there. So I have a lot of my materials that I've already established, and then it's just a matter of tweaking them and making them better based off of the feedback that I get from my supervisees in terms of, how understandable the material is, and how could we take that to the next level for the next time that I provide that training and support.
Do you have the same scope and sequence that you use, or do you change it based on the strengths and challenges of a particular supervisee?
Well, I have a plan in place in terms of scope and sequence that I utilize for my group trainings, my group supervisions, and then I use the individual supervision time to really dig into the things that are specific to the needs for that particular individual. So the group time is spent really focusing on all aspects of the task list, and then the individual time is really geared towards the individual needs of the person.
And I'm sorry, I just love the details here, so I'm going to keep digging at this. What are the... So it sounds like there's a routine to your group supervision meetings, and if that is a correct assumption, can you kind of explain how a group, what that routine might look like in a group supervision experience?
Sure. Well, I think there is some variability depending on the topic, but for example, I may have people present to each other and train each other on a specific topic. So when we get to the point of talking about stimulus preference assessments, I'm going to have one person train everybody on how to do a single presentation stimulus preference assessment. I'm going to have somebody else train everybody within that group on how to do a paired stimulus preference assessment. And then somebody else is going to train everybody on how to do a multiple stimulus without replacement method. And so that way, they are learning how to train other people about behavior analysis. Because in reality, once they have that BCBA certification, that's what people are going to expect them to do. It's not just about being able to do a stimulus preference assessment with their client, but can they teach other people on how to do it? And that's what I want to see them do.
Oh, that's pretty cool. So they have that. You're fostering that skill set right away from literally the get-go.
Exactly.
What thoughts do you have on the specific skill sets that are required for a BCBA? In other words, if someone's been certified for a little while and they're considering doing supervision, what questions should they ask themselves, or what skills should they have in their repertoire? More, using more specific language, I guess, before they start offering supervision as a service.
I think that people should have a pretty broad skill set as it relates to the task list. It doesn't mean that somebody needs to be an expert on every single item within that task list. That would be impossible.
Yeah, that would be a big worry of mine. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be a 10-year graduate program at least. But I think people definitely need to have a strong footing in terms of behaviorism, EAB, and ABA. I think all of those areas are really critical in order to be able to support a supervisee, especially if you're going to be the supervisee's only person, only point of contact in terms of supervision. I would also say that that BCBA needs to have a very strong foundation in behavioral skills training. They need to have the understanding of how to provide a didactic training and provide some initial information to somebody, but what is the process that they're going to use to get to assessing competency within that area? It's not sufficient to just talk about it and move on to the next topic, but how are you going to ensure that that person has competency within that area?
I see. So it's not just I can repeat what the definition of this, that, or the other thing, or verb, just kind of attack a case conceptualization.
Right.
Very cool. Yeah, those are good thoughts on that matter. What I want to do is I've got I'm really fortunate, Lisa. I have these awesome listeners, and when I ask them for questions on topics, they contribute rather readily, and I think this topic of supervision kind of mirrored kind of what I was talking about earlier as it related to the popularity of the panel discussion. So I got an abundance of questions here because this is such a hot topic. So I kind of separated the questions out into kind of general questions about supervision, and again we'll talk about remote supervision in a little bit, but I want to kind of cover the broad aspects of this process first. So having said all that, let's see. Shubhata asks, and Shubhata is an autism mom who's also working on her BCBA as well. So she's got quite a few questions here, and I will start with this one. Is it a good idea to get supervision from multiple supervisors depending on the different areas they are known for or specialize in? It appears to be a very good idea, but may have some drawbacks. She goes on, but I think that's pretty much the gist of the question. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that there is good potential of being able to gain quality supervision from multiple supervisors. The potential is definitely there. And I think the easiest way that can happen is if those supervisors are working together. That way they know what the other person is covering, and they're not repeating each other, or worse yet, contradicting each other. The reality is that there are so many ways to do to do behavior analysis, and there isn't just like one one approach that needs to be done. So, for example, thinking about data collection, one person as a supervisor might say, you need to collect data on every single trial. You need to know what prompt level you used for every single trial. Somebody else might say, we're going to use a single probe data collection procedure. As a supervisee, you're left thinking, well, which one should I do?
Right.
What's right? And so the reality is that both are right. And you can do either way. You just need to have an understanding of why you're using a particular approach and what's going to be best in this particular circumstance. So I think it can be really confusing at times. But if you are going to use multiple supervisors and they are not working in tandem together, I think it's important to have one supervisor focusing on one specific area while another supervisor is working on a different area. And that way that confusion won't happen.
Got it. And that kind of leads into another question she had, because, so I'll just read this one, one of her subsequent questions. So often we as behavior analysts have strong views from broad philosophical leanings that dictate what behavior change to target first to the very specifics while teaching communication skills or even how much to intervene with self-stimulatory behaviors, for example. That's the age-old question, do we let kiddos engage in stereotypic behavior, during downtime, or is that something we should look to eradicate, altogether? Certainly there are different points of view on that, just like there are on the prompting and data collection examples are excellent ones as well. So what happens when we run into these disagreements, I guess? Is there a framework or resource to refer to so that, we can all kind of not get confused and things along those lines? And how do we stay productive given these differing viewpoints about how to do X, Y, or Z in behavior analysis?
I think I guess the approach that I would take in that kind of a situation, if let's just say during a group supervision, people were voicing different perspectives in terms of what data collection system is appropriate and so forth, I would ask that each of the members of the group to do their own research, find one article related to that argues their perspective on data collection, and present that to the whole group in terms of what did this particular research question ask, what were the results, and what were the limitations. And I think at the end of the day, what we all need to be able to understand is that as a profession, we're not always going to agree, and that's okay. How can we communicate with each other in a way that is professional and respectful? And I think that, behavior analysts as a whole have a pretty big challenge in terms of being known as being the dogmatic person in the group.
Oh, sure.
So I think we could all benefit from working through that and being able to communicate our perspective in a way that isn't so standoffish and put people off in that way.
Yeah, and I really like the idea of having the supervisees do their own research on their, to see to what evidence that is out there that may or either challenge or corroborate their opinion. So let's see. Celia asks, what are some of the critical elements you look for when you enter into a supervision contract? For example, I have often been approached to offer supervision and decided to turn down those requests because the settings the candidates worked in did not allow me to observe their work in vivo and or through videos.
Well, certainly the willingness of a company to support the supervision process is really critical. I've definitely been approached by people who want me to supervise them, but the company doesn't want us to talk about the clients. Well, there's nothing for me to supervise there. So that's not an option. So there needs to be some level of being able to do that case conceptualization, clinical problem solving, and so forth. I don't require people to have videotapes with their clients, because I do get the idea that, the company, they don't know who I am. I can say that I'm legitimate and that I'm going to follow all HIPAA requirements and so forth, but they don't know. And so I do understand that level of hesitancy in terms of not wanting somebody to come in and observe in person, especially if, they don't have access to your fingerprinting and your TB tests and all those type of things. So I think that makes sense. But we do need to then have other ways to be able to have a good understanding of what's going on within that system, even if it's just through role playing and being able to provide some performance feedback that way and so forth. I think another important aspect to consider is the follow through of the supervisee. So are they responsive to phone calls? Are they getting back in terms of emails? Are they really taking that supervision relationship seriously? I've found that when I have to chase somebody down a little bit, that usually that's not going to be a successful relationship.
Right. I could totally see that. So Louisa asks, as a new, or at least I hope new, with results pending, behavior analyst, so I'm sure she's waiting on some test results, it sounds like, I am concerned about the fact that I will supervise others. I'm kind of paraphrasing here a little bit. I do not like the system. As soon as someone becomes a PCA, becomes a supervisor, blah, 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 blah. So what advice, here we go again, I'm just kind of, again, paraphrasing. So what advice for a new behavior analyst who will start supervision of others, and about distance supervision, how to do it and how to structure it? Let's hold off on the second question because we're going to get to more in depth on that in a little bit. But again, what advice would you have for new behavior analysts who, I know we talked a little bit about this earlier, but any additional thoughts in terms of ideas for starting supervision?
Yeah, well, I think Louisa is correct in terms of having concerns about, you receive notification of your certification one day, you take 8 hours of supervision training and do the 90-minute module, and technically you're able to supervise. That's a little scary for people, and rightfully so. But I also appreciate what the board has to say on this, that any type of time requirement of being certified before becoming a supervisor, that would just be arbitrary. It doesn't mean that person, because I've been a BCBA for 3 years or whatever the number would be, that all of a sudden I'm going to be a good supervisor. That's not necessarily the case either. So I think that what a new behavior analyst needs to do is to seriously, think critically about their own skills and ask themselves, what can I bring to the table for somebody who is going to be an up-and-coming behavior analyst? What can I give them in terms of new skills? How am I going to use behavioral skills training to support that person? And are there certain areas that I would be a good supervisor at, and other content when I'm just not quite prepared for, and being able to communicate that to somebody who may be a potential supervisee in a very honest way.
Yeah, I think the transparency aspect and the ability to kind of reflect on the things that you are and aren't necessarily skilled in is key there. I could totally see a situation where someone who gets recently supervised, but they've had 15 years experience teaching in a special ed program and might have a whole host of great skills, whereas you could have someone who's been certified for a while and only, has experience in a very small niche area, and, they might not be the best person. So, yeah, I see the idea where the length of time of certification can be an arbitrary, it's not sufficient to demonstrate, I guess, competency as a supervisor. So those are good points. Amber Ellis asks, what are some key characteristics that the supervisee should look for in a supervisor and vice versa?
I think I think a supervisee should be interviewing potential supervisors and really getting a feel for what that supervisor can do for them. You want a supervisor who's very knowledgeable about behavior analysis as a whole, not necessarily somebody who you mentioned, has some expertise in a specific area, unless, of course, you do have multiple supervisors that are going to be able to support you. You definitely want to find somebody who's personable. I think that as a field, we focus a lot on building rapport with our clients when it comes to working with children with autism or individuals with intellectual disabilities. But we also need to build a rapport with the adults that we work with, including our supervisees. So I think that's an important piece as well. You also want to have somebody who is going to be willing to give you constructive feedback in a way that's going to be helpful to you. So again, I think behavior analysts have maybe a bit of a reputation for being a little rough around the edges, I guess. And being a little bit overly critical in terms of our feedback at times. Sure. And I think that that feedback is necessary, but it's not just about what somebody is doing wrong, but also how they can do it better and what are the specific things that they need to do to be able to improve.
She also asks about different things that, from a content perspective, articles, books, etc. What are some recommendations that you assign to your supervisees? Do you have any go-to articles or books or book chapters or anything like that?
Well, one of the things that I don't do is I don't assign a lot of readings. I think that the coursework is where you're supposed to get the bulk of your readings for. So I do assign some seminal articles and so forth. But again, it goes back to what is the goal of that supervision topic. So going back to that example of stimulus preference assessments, I'm going to assign articles related to that specific type of stimulus preference assessment that I want you to teach other people to do. And so it's always going to be tied back to application in some way. I think, honestly, some supervisors maybe inundate people a little bit in terms of all these readings and so forth, but that's teaching content, not application.
I see. Okay. I can see where that's an important distinction. Let's see. Sarah writes in. She says, I am a supervisor for a group supervision practicum course at the university where I teach. I am noticing a lot of not so great field supervisors, either canceling sessions, not showing up, being mostly absent, or not providing adequate feedback. She gave some examples of their not so great behaviors. Does Lisa have any suggestions for working with other BCBA supervisors who aren't living up to their end of the supervision contract? That sounds like delving into some really potentially awkward situations, but it's out there. So let's talk about it.
Absolutely. It kind of reminds me of what I think you referenced, training that Scott has done that's on the B-Side 21 website. Yeah. So
Conversations that Drive Performance, I believe, is the CE from bside21.org. Yep.
Yeah, this totally reminds me of that, how to have those difficult conversations, right? But that's exactly what we need to do, whether it's the supervisee or that group supervisor who's seeing some of that inappropriate behavior, having a conversation about what those expectations are for the supervisor, and where they're kind of letting the supervisee down, so to speak. I think I would go make a reference to the code of ethics in terms of the expectations around not taking too large of a caseload, providing the best quality of service, and meeting our obligations to our clients. And in this case, the supervisee is the client. I think that the ethics code is pretty clear in that respect, that if somebody's not performing in those areas, we have an obligation to have that conversation with that person.
Right. All right, Sridhar from India. I met him at ABAI, a really nice guy. He wrote in with a couple of questions, and I'm probably going to summarize them about for the sake of brevity here. But he has a question about providing constructive feedback, basically, and he references how Aubrey Daniels oftentimes recommends giving 4 positive comments to 1 kind of corrective or negative comment. But his general question is like, if I have a good relationship with my staff members, can I, and he didn't ask it this way, but I'm just trying to interpret the question, can I get away with providing more, can I alter that ratio, if you will, to provide them more feedback on the things that they may need to correct? And again, that it's under the circumstances. If there's assuming that there's a positive working relationship, there's mutual trust, et cetera, et cetera. So, the general, I guess, interpretation of that question is, how do you give feedback? What are your recommendations for providing feedback? Do you have thoughts about ratios of, praise to corrective comments? So let's take his question and kind of, blow it out a little bit to the general aspect of providing feedback, especially in the context of things that you want people to do differently.
Sure. So, I certainly I don't collect data on my ratios of positive to negative feedback, and I don't think that I need to do that. I think I'm pretty much more positive than corrective. I do think that when you do have that solid working relationship in place, you may be able to have a little bit of more flexibility in terms of those ratios. And certainly, I think that some people are really looking for getting those nuances and being able to really build up their skill sets, and they're looking for more critique in a certain respect. And I think that we should honor that and be able to provide that level of analysis for them. I think that that's probably something that you're going to find that you need to start off probably with more positive than corrective initially, and then adjust it based off of how responsive that supervisee is to that feedback.
Yeah, and if I can kind of piggyback onto that, I think from a concepts or principles standpoint, critiques or corrections, corrective feedback more broadly, doesn't necessarily have to equate with, aversive stimuli either.
Right.
And so getting back to what you were just saying, if people are hungry for that type of feedback, those types of interactions may be very reinforcing to them. And I guess it's just a matter of trying to figure out, how people respond on an individual basis to those types of interactions. For some people, providing corrective feedback may be very aversive in nature, and so you might need to be just aware of that. But as you said, there are other people who desperately want to improve, want to enhance their skills, etc. And so those things actually might function as positive reinforcers.
Absolutely.
Great. Let's see. One more. Oh, no, we're into remote supervision already. Wow. All right. So Gita asks, about remote supervision. So as a supervisor, I would be concerned that I'm not seeing the whole picture when I do that. I'm assuming she means supervising remotely. How does one ensure fidelity and enough ecological data to get the big picture?
Well, I think the reality is that the role of any BCBA, whether they are doing remote supervision or supervision in person, has that level of limitation. When you are supervising somebody for 5% of their time, you're getting a snapshot. And that is our reality. So obviously, when we're talking about remote supervision, it takes it to another level. It requires us to make sure that we're looking at things in a variety of ways. So looking at visual displays of data to make decisions, doing a lot of clinical problem solving and talking about interventions, providing models of what that intervention looks like. And in the event that we can't look at videos of implementation with clients, then some videos of role plays and so forth to get the picture that way. But it certainly is a challenge. And so looking at it in a variety of different ways is going to be necessary to take it to the level that we need to.
Okay. Cool. And I'll come back to some listener questions, but I've got my own about remote supervision. So walk us through the nuts and bolts of how you provide it. And I'm thinking, very granular, in a very granular way here, in terms of specific tools, hardware, software. How do you structure the sessions and any other kind of nitty gritty you'd like to share with us?
Sure. So I use GoToMeeting and GoToTraining technology, which is through Citrix. That's something that I used while I was at Spectrum Center, so it was something that I was very familiar with, and it is very easy to use. I'm not far from an IT expert, and so I need something that's pretty intuitive. The supervisee downloads the software for free onto their computer, and it allows us to have an audio connection. It allows us to share computer screens, and then and it's also HIPAA compliant. In terms of like any type of videos that my supervisees are showing to me, they show it from their screen, so they're not sending me videos. And I think that that's really helpful from the perspective of companies in terms of feeling like their clients' information is being protected. So I think that's an important piece.
So just to kind of pause there for a second. So what you're saying is, if I understand you correctly, the video never leaves the supervisee's possession.
Exactly.
And it's not captured on your end of it.
Right.
Okay, cool. That sounds like a pretty handy piece of software there.
Yeah, exactly. So the technology is HIPAA compliant, and so people can't bust in there and watch what we're doing and so forth. So in that way, things are protected as well.
Mm-hmm. So how we talked about the kind of structure of sessions a little bit earlier. Can you do you structure your sessions differently if you're doing it remotely versus in person?
I think when you're talking about remote supervision, the big piece that you have to look at is how are you going to include that competency-based assessment component. And so, for example, if I'm doing a group supervision on discrete trial teaching, I may do the presentation of that, show some models of it. We're going to have some conversations about it. Then during the individual session, I'm going to observe a recording of the individual conducting discrete trial teaching strategies themselves, whether that's with a client or in a role play session or some type of format such as that. Once they've demonstrated competency on how to do discrete trial teachings as for themselves, then they're going to record themselves training somebody else how to do discrete trial teaching. Because ultimately, as a behavior analyst, it isn't just engaging in the skill, but it's training other people to engage in the skill. I think of doing discrete trial teaching as a skill set of a registered behavior technician. Certainly that's a skill set that a BCBA also needs to have, but they also need to have the ability to train somebody else on how to do it. So I'm going to take it to that level.
Now, do you do instruction about discrete trial training ahead of time, or is that something that you assume is covered in coursework? If you do instruction, is there, are there videos that you use or specific resources? How do you handle that piece?
Yeah, so the reality is when you have a group of supervisees coming together, you may have one person who's taking their first day of their very first class, and you might also have somebody who has completed their entire coursework in that same group. So I can't assume a level of knowledge on any of these things. So I'm going to provide some initial didactic training. It's not going to be like, a whole semester of discrete trial teaching and so forth, but it's going to give them enough information for everybody to have this baseline level of knowledge. Depending on what the topic is, the reason why I use that go-to training technology, that has the ability to embed what they refer to as polls into that training. And so, for example, when I'm training on verbal behavior, I'll then include some polls in there to assess somebody's level of understanding about verbal behavior. So, in other words, I would provide some polls that say, here's an example. Is this a man attacked and interverbal and autoclitic? And then you need to test out at 80% or better on being able to identify what verbal operant is in place before you can start then demonstrating your ability to teach verbal operants.
I see. Well, that sounds pretty handy.
Yeah, it's great. With that technology, then after I've completed the training, I can then go back and see how people answered each of those questions. And so I know if I've honestly bombed the training in terms of nobody reached competency and I need to do more work, or if there's one or two folks that need a little bit more support.
And so you might target those individuals in their individual meetings.
Exactly.
I see. Okay, I'm starting to see how it comes together here. Pretty cool. How do you handle all the paperwork?
That's a great question. So basically, I have people. Each supervisee has their own spreadsheet where they are tracking their own fieldwork experience hours, and they're also tracking how much of that is direct and indirect implementation. I also have a spreadsheet that I use to track who's received which trainings in terms of those group supervisions and who's achieved competency within those different areas. Since people are joining the groups at different times, I need to have a system in place to see where they jumped in and what they still need to get covered. And honestly, I'm still continuing to evaluate ways that I can systemize and streamline this process. As I'm growing and taking on more people, I'm sure that my process of paperwork is going to evolve.
I see. Okay, in terms of like getting the sign-offs and all that stuff.
Yeah, that's pretty seamless. I mean, that's just a matter of as people send me their information in terms of their 2 weeks of fieldwork experience, filling out the forms and sending that back to them. That part's pretty, it's just a matter of staying on top of it and doing it very regularly.
I see. Cool. All right, so let's jump back into some listener questions here. Sarah asks, and this is a different Sarah, regarding remote supervision, I'd like to know what Lisa sees are the limitations to this, and what criteria does she use to decide when a supervisee actually requires on-site in-person supervision. Some background for the question. As a program, we have found that these are skills that cannot be addressed remotely, particularly when a supervisee has limited experience. For example, let's say the supervisee has never done a functional analysis before. We find that on-site supervision is the best way for training supervisees in certain skills and also addressing the quote-unquote in-the-moment problem solving. Not only that, we want to observe the supervisee's interactions on a broader level, for example, how they interact with the family or staff in the setting. So it sounds like Sarah might be a little skeptical of remote supervision. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Sarah, but there's some good questions, regardless of the level of apprehension, skepticism, or whatever you want to call it.
Sure. I think that on-site supervision would always be the preference, but it's not always the reality. I work with people who are in remote areas, like in Alabama and in remote areas in other parts of the country where they just don't have access to a behavior analyst on site, and yet they are really trying to do some great work, and we want to be able to support that. I think that there's always going to be some specific skills that require direct observation to fully shape and reinforce. And I think that the example that she used in terms of interactions with parents and staff is a good one for that. The reality is that I'm not going to see how somebody interacts with a parent. That's just not going to be an appropriate use of our time. And so I'm not going to be able to shape that. In terms of somebody who has, I guess, a low baseline level in terms of a specific skill set, like conducting functional analyses or functional assessments, I can support that remotely, but probably not with 5% of their time. It really would require us kind of working shoulder to shoulder and building that skill set each step along the way in order to be able to build that skill. And it takes multiple exemplars. I mean,
Sure.
It's not where you conduct one functional assessment and now you're good to go. It really is something that you have to do many, many times to be able to do it well.
Sure, especially given all the iterations of that process that are out there as documented effective practices too. So it's not multiple exemplars is certainly key there. So let's see. One other question from Celia. I know we talked a little bit about this already, but feel free to add any additional thoughts that you might have. Let's see. What are your strategies for adhering to what are your strategies to adhering quality behavioral skills training and providing immediate feedback with online supervision?
So I think the big piece there is having that video recording of somebody implementing a specific skill and using that as the format for the feedback. I'm in the process of also developing specific checklists for key skill areas. So, for example, if somebody is demonstrating how to provide MAND training for a client, I would have a checklist set up and they would have access to that checklist ahead of time so they know what skill areas I'm looking for, and then be able to provide them with immediate feedback upon viewing that recording as to how they performed in those specific areas.
I see. Pretty cool. So it sounds like it's almost like a task analyzing the task list even further.
Exactly.
Cool. Do you have any other kind of general thoughts on supervision? I know that's an impossibly broad question, but I want to get to a different question real quick. But I just want to make sure if there's anything about supervision. Let me ask the question differently. Is there anything about supervision that you'd like to add or inform our audience of before we leave this topic?
I think your questions, as well as the questions that came from your listeners, were pretty broad and really covered most of the areas that I would think are important in terms of supervision. So I think that we've hit it.
All right, cool. So let's close with the final question here. So, what advice do you have for a recently minted BCBA? Let's say you just passed the exam, you got your certificate in your hand, you've taken your first job, or you're looking for jobs or whatever. So, what advice would you have for that clinician, and whether it has anything to do with supervision or not? It can be about any aspect of clinical practice or life in general.
Well, I would say that the advice that I would give to a new behavior analyst is to surround themselves around strong behavior analysts as well. I think that as somebody who's been a BCBA for 17 years now, long time, I still come across cases that are completely new and that are unexpected. And I love being able to rely on other people to be able to think through the process of how to provide the best quality services to that particular individual. And I do not have all the answers, and I don't think anybody has all the answers. And so relying on the skills of other people, I think is just really, really important. I would say that the other thing that I suggest is to really take advantage of your continuing education opportunities. Don't just go through the motions and sit in the back and text somebody about where you want to go for lunch during that time frame. Go to people who are going to inspire you, and go to trainings that are not just in your area of expertise, but branch out to other areas. I don't consider myself to be an expert in early intervention autism services. So I never went to any trainings by Vince Carbone. But then I had an opportunity to attend a 3-day workshop that he did, and it was amazing. It was so interesting, and I learned so much during that time frame. I felt like I was back in grad school, and in a good way. It wasn't.
Careful how you phrase that, right?
It was so inspiring, and so I wouldn't have necessarily taken advantage of that opportunity. And if I hadn't, I would have really missed out.
Great. That's a great advice to end on. Excuse me. Well, Lisa, I'm sure this is going to generate a lot of discussion amongst our listeners and things like that. So if there are other aspects of supervision, we'd love to have you back on the podcast to take some more questions. Thanks for being such a great sport and answering what we have here for you today. So, and thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely. I had a great time talking about it.
All right. Take care.
All right. You too.
Okay, everyone, I hope you enjoyed that episode as much as I did. I want to let you know that if you are interested in independent fieldwork supervision, you can head on over to BrittonBehavioralConsulting.com. That's Britton, behavioralconsulting.com. And there is a contact tab there on the website. Reach out to Lisa and see if you two are a fit. And let's see, what else? Oh, I've got all sorts of things in the show notes today. I've got the links, obviously, to Lisa's website. I also have links to some articles that are related to today's episode, specifically articles about the supervision process as well as behavioral skills training. I will send a link especially to an overview article of BST by Parsons and others from the Behavior Analysis and Practice Journal. And if not right now, very soon, this particular episode will be eligible for a Supervision CE, a Type 2 continuing ed credit. So if you are looking for that, you can head on over to behavioralobservations.com/get CEs. and you'll find all the details you need to know there. So until session 30, I will see you later. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.